I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. The Bank of Canada raised its key interest rate by 1/4 of a percentage point this morning, bringing it to 5%. Forecasters were widely expecting the move as the economy continues to run hotter than expected. The central bank says that the rate hike was prompted by elevated demand in the economy and strong underlying inflation pressures. Its updated economic projections suggest that it will take longer to get inflation back to the 2% target. It now expects inflation to stall at around 3% for the next year before steadily declining to 2% by mid-2025. The central bank didn't indicate whether it plans to raise rates again in September, and instead said its governing council will continue to monitor how the economy evolves. Well, joining us now to discuss the rate hike is Dr. Moshe Lander, economist and professor at Concordia University. Dr. Lander, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hello.
Now, this move was anticipated by a lot of economists, and part of the justification for this increase was elevated demand. So, Dr. Lander, what is elevated demand, and why is it so hard to tame?
So when demand exceeds supply, whether we're talking about for an economy or whether we're talking about for Taylor Swift concerts, prices tend to rise. So what we have going on right now is that demand within the economy continues to exceed what supply is able to match. And so there's upward pressure on prices. That's inflation, where we would normally accept that demand can outstrip supply to push up prices by about 2% a year. The 3.5% is considered to be too much. And so that need to rein in spending through higher interest rates is to try and match demand and supply better.
And officials have been quite surprised by the resilience of the Canadian economy amid these rate hikes, even amid concerns around a potential recession by some analysts. So why has Canada's economy continued to stay so strong, Dr. Lander?
So one possible explanation is that our population continues to grow at a rather rapid clip. A few weeks ago, right, the big news story was when we crossed over the $40 million Canadian or 40 million Canadian threshold. Now what we have is that these people that are coming into the country are bringing with them, of course, demand, hungry stomachs, need for housing, and they're bringing spending with them. And so all of that is pushing up prices. It's not to say that immigration is a bad thing. It's just that supply can't keep pace with it. And so that continues to put this extra pressure on the economy and on the inflation level.
All right, Dr. Lander, now let's talk a little bit about variable rate mortgages. So are we potentially nearing a tipping point where we're going to see maybe an uptick in insolvencies?
Well, every time the interest rate goes up, we increase the risk or at least maybe the number of insolvencies, right? So there were probably people that at the beginning of this interest rate cycle 18 months ago had just taken out the maximum mortgage that they could afford, stretched themselves to the limit at those record low interest rates. And when interest rates just went up that initial 25 basis points, that probably ensnared a few people. But as it keeps going up and up, it's going to catch more and more people. So I don't know that it's necessarily going to lead to an abnormal number of increases in insolvencies, but yeah, it's going to catch more people. Interest rates have gone up essentially 5 percentage points in 18 months. That's enough to make anybody pause.
Definitely. Now, with the forecast for inflation to stall at around 3% for the next year, do you think that the Bank of Canada might include another rate hike in the upcoming future?
Yeah, they have 3 meetings left this year, one in September, one in October, one in December. I would probably now say that there's a good bet that at least one of those is going to include an interest rate increase. It was foolish of them to say that they were going to have inflation back to 2% by the summer of this year. At the earliest, I didn't think that this was possible before the beginning of 2024. They're now saying 2025, so even that's beyond what I would have projected. But the reality is that it was a foolish target to begin with. And so any extra increases in interest rates are because they feel that inflation might be stalling, and they continue to need to discourage Canadians from spending excessively, like we said at the outset.
And on that note, why is the Bank of Canada's target rate at 2%, Dr. Lander? Should that target maybe be adjusted?
No, 2% is the right number, and that pretty much goes for any major economy around the world. If I can use an outdated analogy, the idea that a little bit of grease is good for the wheel is kind of the way that we need to view inflation within an economy. If you give too much inflation, as we saw, it creates chaos and confusion and panic, and people get really frustrated if the inflation rate is too high. But if you make the inflation rate too low, the economy is not going to be able to move forward. So it's that analogy that you put too much grease on the wheel, it just spins and doesn't go anywhere. Don't put enough, the wheel cracks and it falls apart. So you need just a little bit of inflation to keep it humming along. Anything less than 2 would be insufficient. More than 2, and you risk this escalating inflation that if we believe it's going to be 3% now, we start asking for 3%, and next thing you know, we actually have 4% inflation, and it takes off from there.
All right, Dr. Lander, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time.
Anytime.
In a legal decision described as the first of its kind in Canada, a Halifax sex worker successfully sued a client for non-payment of services. Former sex worker Brogan Sheehan took Bradley Samuelson to small claims court. This was after he didn't fully pay her fee, which both parties had agreed to beforehand. Mr. Samuelson argued that the agreement was invalid because it is illegal to purchase sexual services. But court adjudicator Daryl Pink said that the contract could still be enforced and awarded Ms. Sheehan $1,800. Sex work remains criminalized in Canada, but a 2014 law removed criminal penalties for people like Ms. Sheehan who sell sexual services. Paying for sex, however, remains illegal. Well, joining us now to discuss the case and its implications is attorney Jessica Rose, the lawyer that represented Ms. Sheehan in this case. Ms. Rose, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
Now, before we really dive into this case, can you give us an idea of the current conditions and the economic realities of sex work in Canada and how the legal system is impacting both workers and clients alike?
Sure. Well, I think this is probably a really understudied area, and understandably, people are hesitant to come forward, both sex workers and clients, to share what their real lived experiences are of being involved in sex work. But we know anecdotally that many of our clients come forward and tell us there are many times I haven't been paid for my work. And it just doesn't seem to be a very unusual thing. It's seen right now as being just one of the things that sex workers have to deal with in their industry on a regular basis, which is concerning.
And in this case, this ruling is being called the first of its kind. So, what does this ruling mean for the legitimacy of sex work in Canada, maybe in the future from a legal perspective?
Well, we hope this is the first of many cases. This is a precedent-setting case as far as we're aware. This is the first time that this issue has come before a court in Canada. But certainly we know, as I mentioned before, that this happens frequently enough that there are many sex workers who could bring their case and succeed. Now that we have this precedent that they can turn to and they can say, we know that this has been accepted by a Canadian court now, that a contract for sex work is enforceable. And so we hope that this has really opened the floodgates for sex workers to be coming forward and using the courts to enforce their rights.
And as you say, this is a precedent-setting case. So how do you see this impacting maybe future cases of similar circumstances involving sex workers?
Well, now that there is a framework for this, and we hope to be really spreading the gospel as an organization, along with Brogan, our client, who's very passionate about this issue and is herself a peer mentor and an advocate. So, we hope to be taking this message on the road and showing other people in the industry, other organizations that support sex workers, here's the template for how you can bring this kind of a case. And it's actually quite straightforward, especially using the small claims court process. It's meant for lay people to bring forward their cases without legal assistance. So it's meant to remove a lot of those barriers that prevent people from using the civil justice system in terms of it being too expensive, complex, onerous. So we hope that really small claims court is an avenue for sex workers all across the country to be able to bring forward their claims and get paid.
And maybe for a broader perspective, do you think this case may have opened the door for a conversation around the legalization of sex work in Canada, Bev?
We really hope so. I think it's a long overdue conversation, and a lot of advocacy groups have been warning the government for some time of this gap in the law, this gap among others for sure, in saying that the economic rights of sex workers have really been left behind in these, in the changes that Parliament enacted about a decade ago now. And not to say that safety, security, these are important issues as well, but economic rights and being able to enforce contracts for their work is really absent in the current legislation. It's a huge void. So this is an opportunity to get that conversation going and get some legislative amendments that really speak more squarely to this issue and try and fill that gap.
All right, Ms. Rose, a quick 30 seconds left here, but what would the ideal legal framework around sex work in Canada look like?
That's a big question. I think at the very least, what sex workers should be entitled to is just the ease of accessing the civil justice system in the same way that a carpenter or a lawyer would if someone didn't pay their fees. And the fact that we had to go to court in order to try and decide this issue, get a court to comment on this issue of whether or not a contract for sex work is enforceable, just like any other contract for services, it illuminates the very problem that the legislation presents, which is that it's just silent.
A recently published book by a Canadian think tank claims that Canada is under what it calls routine and corrosive attacks. The work, titled The 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Cancelled, takes aim at cancel culture. It says the rise of critical theory, identity politics, and ideological politics in the education system play a part in this issue. The book consists of essays and other writings by 20 Canadian voices, and it is divided into 3 distinctive parts. Dr. Mark Milkey is the editor of the book and the president of the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, the think tank that published this book. Joining us now to discuss this project and its importance to Canadians is Dr. Mark Milkey himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on, Nima.
Quite the interesting book that you have provided us, Dr. Milkey. Now, something that really stood out to me is the language used in this book, especially in the media sheet you provided us. I want to point to the routine and corrosive attacks by modern society against Canada. Part of this book points to academic doctrines such as the rise of identity politics, socialism, critical race theory, and others as contributing to this issue. So can you tell us a little bit more about the facts and the science behind all these claims and what other factors are playing into this?
Sure. Well, for example, when one of my board members has his son come home with, something a teacher gave him, which is called a privilege wheel, where depending on your skin color, your gender, your faith or lack thereof, you're privileged or not, this is corrosive. And it's backwards, and it's rolling back the progress that has been made in Canada over the years. Ontario started to ban discrimination based on ethnicity, on gender, in accommodation and housing and employment in the early 1950s. That was systemic racism before they outlawed it. Today, you can meet an individual bigot somewhere, but it's not the same. Canada in 2023 is not Alabama in 1923. So, and to suggest otherwise is simply to be ignorant of the facts and history. So what we try and do in the 1867 project is say, are you really sure you want to treat Canada as an oak tree that you want to rip down, as opposed to understanding that nations like Canada, like any society and a civilization, takes decades, hundreds of years to build. And when you see something wrong, what you do is you prune a branch that's diseased and it makes the tree stronger. That's the analogy for Canada. Canada's never been perfect. It's not perfect now. It never will be perfect because you and I are imperfect. And people will look at us 100 years from now and ask, why did you think X? So some modesty is required. Past generations, starting 20,000 years ago with the first Indigenous people, as we call them now, who crossed the Bering Strait, came here, started to build the country. There are many things to be proud of without ignoring the bad spots in the past.
Now, this book also claims that historical Canadian figures like John A. Macdonald, Egerton Ryerson, they have been wrongfully cancelled by modern society. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and the evidence and facts that this book provides to back this claim?
Sure. Greg Piasatsky, who's a Toronto lawyer and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, wrote a great chapter on John A. Macdonald. To give you one clear example, Macdonald, helped create what we now know as the RCMP, the Northwest Mounted Police. And the thinking behind that was to protect Indigenous peoples on the prairies from newer settlers. And that's exactly what they did. And Macdonald was incredibly sympathetic, actually, for his era to Indigenous folk, which is not what you hear these days. So Greg goes into some detail in the 1867 project to say, hold on, before you cancel a guy, literally renaming schools, taking down statues, you might want to better understand what he in fact did. And when he was responding to him, he was a racist. People in his day were racist. It was 1867. But even MacDonald was responding to a liberal opposition of his day that didn't want to do anything for Indigenous peoples, and in fact told him to spend less on them. And MacDonald said, no, we're going to rescue them from famine on the prairies. These are not facts that are well known. It doesn't mean MacDonald was perfect or hold the views we do today, but that's not the way to look at history. But did he help in some ways contribute to the Canada that we became? And the answer to that is yes, the good Canada that we became.
All right, Dr. Milky, now I just have about a minute left here, but moving forward in terms of building a better Canada, we're hearing a lot about this is only going to be possible through Indigenous reconciliation, acknowledgement of the past, acknowledgement of historic leaders and their connection to residential school systems, the dark side of Canada's history, as some may say. So where does this book stand when it comes to addressing Indigenous reconciliation, intergenerational trauma, and the acknowledgement of the past?
Well, there's a lot there. Let me say this. What Canadians need to do is unite around laudable ideas, not divide around identities, whether it's Indigenous or anything else. Laudable ideas such as the worth of the individual, the fact that women have rights in Canada and should, which was an early development in Canada compared to many countries, unite around the laudable ideas that in fact started in the 19th century, the worth of the individual in law and policy, unite around free and open inquiry and free markets, a free society, unite around laudable ideas, don't divide based on identities. That's been what most of human history has done, and it ends badly.
We'll be right back. There's a new social media platform in town, and Twitter doesn't seem too happy about it. 100 million people had signed up for Threads last week in just the first 5 days after Meta unveiled it, according to CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Threads is billed as a text-based version of Meta's photo-sharing app Instagram. However, it hasn't been entirely smooth sailing for the new social media platform. In a cease and desist letter last week, Twitter threatened legal action against Instagram parent company Meta over the new app. Threads creators have pushed back, but just how similar are these apps? Legal experts say much is still unknown about it, but people starting to explore Threads are already making their own observations. Some have called it a Twitter clone, but others note key differences between the two apps. Well, joining us now to discuss the launch of Threads is Brendan Caldwell, director at Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back.
Thank you, Nima. Who better to get to discuss the intricacies of cutting-edge social media technology than a 53-year-old. So let's do this.
My thoughts exactly. Now, Meta just launched its new social media app Threads, as we mentioned, but how exactly does this new app work?
The truthful answer, Nima, is I have no idea how exactly it works. My understanding is that when Mr. Musk let go of a lot of Twitter people, they walked proverbially across the street and were hired by Mr. Zuckerberg to create something similar. So if it looks and feels a lot like Twitter, it may be much the same people that made the one as made the other. So there may be for Twitter users some nostalgia, if you can be nostalgic about social media. Has it been around long enough? But there may also be some issues, as you alluded to earlier, the cease and desist order. If a lot of those people who walked across the street took their proprietary knowledge with them, that might end up being an issue for Meta. We'll have to see.
We'll definitely have to see, Brendan. Now, there's a lot still not known about Threads, but the user experience between Threads and Twitter seems to be very similar. But how is Threads able to differentiate itself from Twitter amid this competitive market?
I think their main thrust is we are not Elon Musk. So Elon Musk is very polarizing. He's done wonderful things with technology. He has really created the green car revolution, but not all of his ideas square with what's in the zeitgeist about how the world should be. So those that don't agree with Elon may find themselves wanting to have another platform. It won't be the first time that social media has been politicized, but I think this may be a new chapter unfolding as the big tech giants all go to war. I mean, they all claim to have hundreds of millions to billions of users. There's only so many people on social media. I ain't being one of them. But when they're fighting over the same market, it's understandable that in the modern era of technology robber barons, that when there was an opening or a vulnerability with one of the giants, another would go after it, which is, I think, what we're seeing here.
Now, we spoke a little bit about controversy around Elon Musk, but with other Meta products, such as the metaverse, now that hasn't been widely accepted by consumers as expected. So do you think a similar response would happen with Threads?
Who knows? Who knows how it's all going to unveil itself? So if Meta is doing something, businesses, companies, advertisers will want to be on board just in case. You're right, the metaverse and indeed the name Meta seems quaintly dated, although it only switched over from Facebook, a year, 2 years ago? It wasn't very long ago, because we were all going to do everything virtually. Well, as it turns out, not even young people want to do everything virtually. There is a desire for the human connection, so that companies would work entirely remotely, virtually in this metaverse just isn't going to fly, because there is this biologic need for a human connection that all the technology in the world, I don't think, is going to replace, at least not anytime soon. So yeah, Mark Zuckerberg got it wrong, but as you could fairly say, Thomas Edison got 10,000 iterations of the light bulb wrong before he actually got a carbon filament to work. So just because Zuckerberg didn't call it right on one doesn't mean he's going to call it wrong on this one.
Looks like we've got a lot to keep our eyes out for. Brendan, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for a look at important conversations from this past week. Thanks again for joining us on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you next time, Canada. Have a great weekend.